Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. You know, some of the more obnoxious amongst the viewers here who send hate mail to me usually or often start it with if they don't like the review of something, I'd like to see you do it as well as artist such and such. Yeah, a really stupid remark, frankly, because you don't need to be able to do it as well as artist such and such to know that artist such and such sucks. I mean, we know that you don't have to be a chef to know that your food sucks. You don't have to, be an auto mechanic to know that you bought a lemon when your car doesn't start. I mean, that kind of criticism is simple foolishness. However, there was a critic who was a dear friend of mine who actually could do it better, or at least as well, as most of those who he criticized. And I just wanted to talk about him a little bit because he was such a great guy, and it's an interesting story. And those of you who, are into the lore of music criticism, of the personalities, probably already have heard of him or know him. And those of you who haven't, you should. It was Harris Goldsmith. There he is. Good old Harris. Yeah. Harris was a pianist and music critic and music teacher and professor, an extraordinarily musical human being. He started writing criticism in 1960, the year before I was born. He passed away, I believe, in the early 2000s. It was about then. Because at the end of his career, like so many in this music business, you read stories about famous composers like Vivaldi who died in poverty, and you think, oh, that couldn't possibly happen now. Sadly, it happened to Harris. Harris had a career as a concert pianist, limited, but he made some recordings and things like these, Beethoven sonatas. We'll talk about those in a moment. And he was, toward the end of his life, suffering financially. And I remember I really wanted him to come and write for us at ClassicsToday.com. But the problem is that Harris was really old school, and he didn't even have a computer. He barely had a typewriter. He didn't even have a computer. And when I talked to him about it, he said to me, I just can't do it. I was willing to get him the equipment, but he simply felt that he couldn't learn to do it at that stage in his career, and his health wasn't good, and he had issues, and I just felt terrible about it. It was a person who educated a generation of younger musicians, a generation of budding music critics. He wrote for High Fidelity, principally, and its successor magazines, and he reviewed mostly piano repertoire. He was a pianist and also orchestral repertoire. He was a rabid Toscanini fan. Toscanini and Cantelli, actually, but, Toscanini particularly. And he remembered virtually every concert he ever saw. He had a phenomenal musical memory. In terms of musical education, he didn't just train pianists. He was a wonderful all-around musician. He had his degrees from the Manhattan School of Music, and he trained cellists and other instrumentalists because he was simply just musically brilliant. He really was, and funny, and splendidly amusing. I mean, and his criticism was notably barbed. He did not pull his punches, but he managed to have a very, very good time, make us laugh while he was assaulting his victims. And I learned a lot from him. We used to have dinner together, on occasion, and we would talk about this. And, his philosophy was really one of trying always to convey the joy that music gave him to everybody in his reviews. And the thing that offended him most was a performance that lacked that joy, that communicativeness. There is an issue, actually, because the funny thing about it is that if you have his Beethoven recordings, which are here on Brilliant Classics, the sonics are not great, but the performances are amazing. There's a Waldstein sonata on here that is one of the most thrilling things you've ever heard in your life. The first movement, particularly, is it's a combination of speed and clarity and nuance, which no great pianist that ever lived could afford to disdain. I mean, it's remarkable. You get the Waldstein here. You have the C minor, Opus 10, number 1. That's a live performance in lousy sound. And you've got Piano Sonata number 31 in A flat. The Storm Sonata, number 17 in D minor, a few short pieces for Elise is in here, and the Bagatelles, Opus 126, which are marvelously quirky and interesting and full of wonderful little touches and things. I mean, he really was an amazing musician. And so when he criticized a pianist, particularly, he could actually do it better than the pianists he was criticizing. And he launched into all of them. He was actually appreciated early in his career by none less than Claudio Arrau, who has a little blurb on the back here, just to show you the esteem with which he was held. Arrau wrote, listening to Harris Goldsmith play was literally one of the most gratifying musical experiences I can remember. Listening to him, I had tears in my eyes with pleasure and happiness. I do not know when I have heard a young pianist with such an instinctive musicianship, with such a mature perception and imagination. Well, there you go. I mean, and yet his career never took off as a concert pianist. He was a quirky guy. There may have been some personal issues there. He reminds me a bit of stories of Bruckner. You know, he was always looking for a young wife. You know, he never did anything about it, but he was always, into these young girls and looking for a girlfriend. And Harris, in a way, was like a big baby, in a way. There was an innocence about him, a simplicity, a directness. And his approach to music was like that too. It was all just totally without artifice, completely. There wasn't an affected bone in his body. He felt what he felt, and he just expressed it in his playing, in his criticism, in his relationships. It was really strange. He was naive. He really was. I think, at the end of the day, that you would say that he was a naive character. But what an amazing musical mind he had. And I was thinking about him recently because, the fact of the matter is, as a society, we don't take very good care of our artists. If they don't get rich, if they don't make lots of money, there's not a safety net for people who've devoted their lives to music in a way which is, it's not very remunerative, right? Is that the word? Remunerative, yeah, whatever. You don't get lots of money out of it. And, that's what happened to Harris. Here you have a guy who was incredibly gifted as a musician, a wonderful teacher. He was beloved by everybody in the critical profession. He really was. But he wound up in dire straits toward the end of his life. And nobody really seemed to care. I think that's really a sad and shocking commentary on how we look at the arts and culture and the people who contribute to it, most passionately, because he was certainly one of those. He was 100% dedicated to a life in music and to talking about music and to proselytizing for music. He was that kind of a person. I really felt honored to have known him as well as I did. And I have to say, as a young critic starting out, and somebody who had nothing like the musical background and education and training and knowledge that he had, he was totally and completely 100% supportive. All he cared about was your musical observations and perceptions, and if he thought that they were valid or not. And we would talk about these things, and for hours at a time. You could always find him hanging around the New York record stores near Lincoln Center. He could be at Tower Records or at the HMV store, and he would talk to anybody. It's what he loved. He would talk to anybody. He would show pictures of his newest students. He would, have music scores dripping off of him, and he would go into it at the drop of a hat. All he cared about was if you were serious about music, as serious about it as he was. And what a delightful person and a gifted person. I'm thrilled that this Brilliant Classics little 2-disc set of Beethoven sonatas is around. If you haven't heard it, you probably should, because there aren't that many critics, really good critics, who are also really good performers and who would have had the most concrete possible answer to the naysayers who would accuse him of not being able to criticize famous performer because, he couldn't do it as well as famous performer could. Well, yeah, he could. And it was quite an education having the opportunity to know him for as long as I did, and enjoy his company as much as I did. Terrific person, and somebody whose name does not deserve to disappear, whose work shouldn't be forgotten, and whose legacy really should have a permanent place in the story of classical music, at least in the United States, in the second half of the 20th century. So I wanted to share those thoughts with you, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll go out and do a little investigating yourself and give Harris a bit of a listen. I think he would have been very happy to know that you were doing that. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.